A single father who had spent 4 years as the perfect secretary asked his cold-blooded CO a question no one saw coming. "Can you be my date for my ex-wife's wedding?" She said no. Flat final. So he walked into that wedding alone, straight into the stares, the whispers, and the pitying smiles. His ex-wife's voice cut through the crowd, dripping with condescension. His dignity crumbled piece by piece. And just when he was ready to leave, as the man everyone expected him to be, a black car pulled up to the entrance. Nathan Reed had worked as Victoria Ashford's executive secretary for 4 years. For years of perfectly organized schedules, flawless meeting preparations, and not a single personal conversation that lasted more than 30 seconds. He arrived at 7:45 every morning, 15 minutes before she did. And he left only after her car pulled out of the parking garage. That was the job. That was the boundary. And Nathan had never once considered crossing it until the ivory envelope arrived in his mailbox on a Tuesday evening. The wedding invitation was elegant, expensive, and cruel in the most civilized way possible. Rachel and Brandon Hayes requested the pleasure of his presence at the celebration of their union. The venue was the Grand View Hotel, the kind of place where a single floral arrangement cost more than Nathan's monthly grocery budget. He stood in his small apartment kitchen, reading the gold-embossed letters over and over, while Lily finished her homework at the dining table behind him. His daughter was 8 years old, and she had her mother's eyes, the same eyes that had once looked at him with love, then disappointment, then nothing at all. Lily had been the one who insisted he come. Rachel had called 2 weeks earlier, her voice perfectly pleasant and perfectly distant, explaining that their daughter wanted both parents at the wedding. It would be good for Lily to see them being civil, she said. It would show her that adults could move on gracefully. Nathan had agreed because he always agreed when it came to his daughter. But standing there with the invitation in his hand, he understood what this really was. Rachel wanted him there, not for Lily's sake, but for her own, to prove that she had won, that she had traded up, that the man who couldn't give her the life she wanted would now witness her getting everything she dreamed of with someone else. The next morning at work, Nathan moved through his routine with mechanical precision. He prepared Victoria's coffee, black, no sugar, and placed it on her desk at exactly 8 o'clock. He reviewed her schedule, confirmed her afternoon meetings, and handled 3 calls from board members who wanted to reschedule. Victoria barely looked up from her laptop, acknowledging him with brief nods and one-word responses. This was normal. This was how it had always been. She was not cold out of cruelty. She simply operated on a different frequency, one where efficiency mattered more than pleasantries. Nathan respected that about her. He had learned to read her moods through the slight tension in her jaw, the speed of her typing, the way she held her pen during conference calls. After 4 years, he knew her better than most people in her life. And yet, she knew almost nothing about him. That changed on a Thursday afternoon when Nathan's phone buzzed with a text from Lily's school. Parent-teacher conference reminder. He stepped out to the hallway to call the school office and reschedule, keeping his voice low and professional. But when he returned to his desk, he found Victoria standing by the window, her back to him, her reflection visible in the glass. She had heard him. Not the words perhaps, but the tone, the softness that crept into his voice whenever he spoke to his daughter, the warmth that he kept carefully hidden during office hours. She didn't mention it. She never did. But Nathan noticed that she glanced at the framed photo on his desk for the first time, the one of Lily at her 6th birthday party, grinning with chocolate frosting on her nose. 5 days before the wedding, Nathan made a decision that contradicted everything he believed about boundaries. He waited until 6:30 after the office had emptied and Victoria was reviewing quarterly reports alone in her corner office. The city lights were beginning to flicker on outside her window, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk. Nathan knocked twice, then entered without waiting for permission, something he had never done before. Victoria looked up, her expression unreadable, and he could see the question forming in her eyes even before she spoke. "I need to ask you something," Nathan said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Too formal, too stiff. He had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in his head, and now every word felt wrong. Victoria sat down her pen and leaned back in her chair, giving him her full attention for the first time that day. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 4 years of professional distance, and Nathan forced himself to continue before he lost his nerve. "My ex-wife is getting married this Saturday. I've been invited. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. My daughter will be there. She's 8. She's going to watch her mother marry a man who owns half the commercial real estate in this city. And she's going to see her father standing alone in the corner, being looked at like someone who couldn't measure up. Victoria's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, a slight tension in her shoulders, a barely perceptible tilt of her head. She was listening, really listening. And that gave Nathan the courage to say what he had come to say. I know this is completely inappropriate. I know it crosses every line we've established, but I need to ask you anyway. He met her eyes directly, refusing to look away, even though every instinct told him to retreat. Would you consider being my date for the wedding? Not as anything real, just as someone standing next to me. So my daughter doesn't have to see her father as the man everyone pies. The words hung in the air between them, raw and exposed. Nathan watched Victoria's face, searching for any sign of reaction. Anger, amusement, disgust, but she gave him nothing. Her expression remained perfectly composed, perfectly unreadable, like a poker player holding the winning hand. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity, and Nathan began to prepare himself for the rejection he knew was coming. I don't do things like that. Victoria's voice was flat, final. No explanation, no apology, just a simple statement of fact. Nathan nodded slowly, absorbing the blow with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through his divorce, through the custody battles, through 3 years of raising a child alone while working 60-hour weeks. He had expected this answer. He had known even as he walked into her office that she would say no. But he had asked anyway because Lily's face kept appearing in his mind. Lily watching him be dismissed, diminished, reduced to a footnote in her mother's grand romantic story. I understand, Nathan said, and he meant it. He turned to leave, his hand already reaching for the door handle when Victoria's voice stopped him. When is the wedding? Nathan looked back over his shoulder. Victoria had picked up her pen again, her attention seemingly returned to the documents in front of her, but she was waiting for an answer. He could tell by the stillness of her hand, the way the pen hovered motionless above the paper. Saturday, 6 o'clock, the Grand View Hotel. He paused, unsure what to make of the question. But you said I don't do things like that. Victoria's eyes flicked up to meet his. And for just a moment, Nathan thought he saw something there. Curiosity, perhaps, or something softer that he couldn't name. I didn't say anything else. Good night, Nathan. It was a dismissal, clear, unmistakable. Nathan nodded once and left her office, closing the door quietly behind him. He walked to the elevator in a daze, replaying the conversation in his mind, trying to decode what had just happened. She had said no. That much was certain. But she had also asked about the wedding, the date, the time, the location. Why would she need that information if she had no intention of coming? He told himself not to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope had gotten him through his marriage, convincing him that things would get better, that Rachel would eventually see how hard he was trying, that love could survive on effort alone. It couldn't. He had learned that lesson the hard way, signing divorce papers in a lawyer's office while Rachel talked about fresh starts and finding herself. Hope was a luxury Nathan couldn't afford anymore. He had Lily to think about. He had a job to keep. He had a life to maintain, even if that life felt smaller and quieter than it used to be. On Friday night, Nathan laid out his suit on the bed and stared at it for a long time. It was new, not expensive, but respectable, dark gray, well-fitted, the kind of suit a man wore when he wanted to look like he had his life together. Lily was already asleep in her room, tired from a day of school and swimming lessons, and the apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. Nathan sat on the edge of his bed, his hands clasped between his knees, and let himself feel the weight of what tomorrow would bring. He would walk into that wedding alone. He would smile at people who whispered behind his back. He would watch Rachel become someone else's wife and pretend that it didn't matter. And through it all, Lily would be watching, absorbing everything, forming her own conclusions about what kind of man her father was. He had no backup plan, no secret hope that Victoria would change her mind. She had said nothing, and that was the end of it. Tomorrow he would face his past with nothing but a new suit and whatever dignity he could scrape together. It would have to be enough. Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect weather that felt almost mocking. Clear skies, golden afternoon light, the sort of day that belonged on postcards and wedding announcements. Nathan spent the morning keeping Lily busy with breakfast and cartoons, trying not to think about what the evening would bring. She had picked out her dress weeks ago, a pale blue one with tiny flowers embroidered along the hem, and she kept asking him if she looked pretty enough for the wedding. He told her she looked beautiful. He told her she was the prettiest girl in the whole city. And when she smiled at him with that gap-toothed grin, he almost believed that tonight might not be as terrible as he feared. They left the apartment at 5:15, giving, clear's throat, themselves plenty of time to reach the Grand View Hotel. Nathan had called a car service for the occasion, an expense he couldn't really afford, but one that felt necessary. He refused to arrive at his ex-wife's extravagant wedding in his 12-year-old sedan with the dent in the passenger door. Lily sat beside him in the back seat, her small hand clutching his, and she chatted about flower girls and cake flavors, and whether Brandon's house had a swimming pool. Nathan answered her questions as best he could, keeping his voice light and steady. Even as the hotel's glass towers came into view, and his stomach tightened into a knot, the Grand View Hotel was everything Rachel had always wanted and everything Nathan had never been able to give her. Crystal chandeliers hung from vate ceilings. Marble floors gleamed under soft lighting. Enormous floral arrangements. White roses. Lilies stood like silent sentinels at every corner, their fragrance thick and overwhelming. Nathan stepped into the lobby with Lily's hand in his, and immediately felt the weight of 100 invisible eyes. He was wearing his new dark gray suit, the one he had laid out so carefully the night before, but surrounded by men in tailored designer jackets and women dripping with diamonds. He might as well have been wearing a costume from a second-hand store. The reception area was already crowded with guests mingling and laughing, champagne flutes catching the light as they were raised in casual toasts. Nathan recognized no one. These were Brandon's people, business partners, investors, the kind of wealthy acquaintances who attended weddings, not out of affection, but out of obligation and networking opportunity. He guided Lily toward the check-in table where a young woman in a black dress handed him a seating card and directed him to table 14. The table numbers went up to 20. He was quite literally seated at the margins. They found their table near the back of the ballroom, tucked behind a pillar that partially blocked the view of the main stage. Nathan pulled out a chair for Lily and helped her settle in, adjusting the napkin on her lap and pouring her a glass of water from the crystal pitcher on the table. The other seats were still empty. He didn't know who would be joining them, and he wasn't sure he wanted to find out. Lily looked around with wide eyes, taking in the grandeur of the room, the towering ice sculptures, the string quartet playing softly in the corner. She had never seen anything like this. Neither had Nathan, if he was being honest. The ceremony began at 6 o'clock sharp. Rachel walked down the aisle in a gown that probably cost more than Nathan's annual salary. Her face radiant with the kind of happiness he hadn't seen since the early years of their marriage. Brandon waited for her at the altar, tall and confident, his smile bright enough to be seen from the back row. Nathan watched them exchange vows, their voices amplified through hidden speakers, and he felt something strange settle in his chest. Not jealousy exactly, but a dull ache of recognition. He had once stood where Brandon was standing. He had once believed that love was enough to build a life on. He had been wrong. Lily tugged at his sleeve as the officiant pronounced them husband and wife. "Daddy, why does Mommy look so happy?" Her voice was innocent, curious, without any of the complicated emotions that churned beneath Nathan's carefully composed exterior. He looked down at her and managed a smile that he hoped didn't look as hollow as it felt. "Because she's starting a new chapter," he said quietly. "And new chapters are exciting." The reception that followed was a carefully choreographed display of wealth and taste. Waiters in white gloves circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvres that Nathan couldn't identify. A 12-piece band replaced the string quartet, filling the ballroom with music that made conversation difficult and mingling mandatory. Nathan stayed close to Lily, fetching her plates of food from the buffet, making sure she had enough to drink, keeping her entertained with quiet games and whispered jokes. He was trying to be invisible, to get through the evening without drawing attention to himself, without becoming a story that guests would tell at brunch the next morning. That plan lasted approximately 45 minutes. Rachel found him near the dessert table where Lily was carefully selecting a chocolate eclair from an arrangement that looked more like art than food. The bride was still in her wedding gown, though she had changed into more comfortable shoes, and she approached Nathan with the kind of gracious smile that never quite reached her eyes. Two of her bridesmaids flanked her like bodyguards, their faces arranged in expressions of polite curiosity. "Nathan, you came." Rachel's voice was warm, pleasant, pitched perfectly for the audience she knew was watching. "I wasn't sure you would." Nathan straightened his shoulders, keeping his expression neutral. "Lily wanted me here." "Of course she did." Rachel glanced at their daughter, who was obliviously focused on her éclair, then turned back to Nathan with that same practiced smile. "I'm glad you could make it." "Really? I just assumed you'd bring someone. A girlfriend, maybe. Or are you still?" She let the sentence trail off, the implication hanging in the air like a bad smell. "Still what?" Nathan asked, though he already knew the answer. Rachel laughed lightly, the sound tinkling and false. "Oh, you know, still doing the single dad thing. It must be exhausting working all those hours and raising Lily on your own. I don't know how you manage." She reached out and touched his arm in a gesture that was meant to look sympathetic but felt like a brand. "Some people just aren't meant to find someone else. And that's okay, Nathan. Really, there's nothing wrong with being alone." Before Nathan could respond, Brandon appeared at Rachel's side, sliding an arm around her waist with the easy confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of tan that came from weekend golf games and Caribbean vacations. His handshake, when he offered it to Nathan, was firm to the point of aggression. "The ex-husband," Brandon said, and though his tone was friendly, there was something underneath it, a smugness, a superiority that he didn't bother to hide. "Rachel's told me a lot about you. Thanks for coming, man. I know it can't be easy." Nathan felt his jaw tighten. "Congratulations on the wedding." "Thanks. We're pretty happy." Brandon glanced around the room, taking in the grandeur of the celebration he had funded. "Rachel deserves all of this, you know. She spent too many years settling for less. I'm just glad I could give her the life she always wanted." The words landed like punches, each one precise and devastating. Nathan understood what Brandon was really saying. "You couldn't do this. You weren't enough. She upgraded. And now everyone can see exactly how far she's risen." He wanted to respond, to defend himself, to point out that love wasn't measured in square footage or stock portfolios. But Lily was standing right there, chocolate on her fingers, looking up at the adults with confusion in her eyes. So Nathan swallowed his pride and nodded once, his face carefully blank. "I hope you're both very happy," he said, and the words tasted like ash in his mouth. Rachel and Brandon drifted away, absorbed back into the crowd of well-wishers and syphons, and Nathan was left standing by the dessert table with his daughter and the shattered remains of his dignity. He thought that was the worst of it. He was wrong. The whispers started slowly, spreading through the ballroom like ripples in a pond. Nathan caught fragments as he moved through the crowd, pitying glances, raised eyebrows, conversations that stopped abruptly when he walked by. A woman in a red dress looked at him with something close to sympathy and murmured to her companion, "That's the ex-husband? Poor thing." A man in a pinstriped suit asked Nathan what he did for a living, and when Nathan answered that he was an executive secretary, the man's smile flickered with barely concealed condescension. "A secretary? Well, that's a solid profession. Very stable." Nathan endured it all with the same quiet stoicism that had gotten him through his divorce, his custody battle, the countless small humiliations of being a single father in a world that still expected men to be providers first and parents second. But then a friend of Brandon's, a loud, red-faced man who had clearly had too much champagne, cornered him near the bar and asked the question that finally cracked his composure. "So, you're the guy who couldn't keep Rachel happy, huh?" The man laughed, clapping Nathan on the shoulder like they were old friends. "Don't feel bad, buddy. Some women are just meant for bigger things. Better to know your place, right?" Nathan didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat had closed up and his hands were shaking slightly, and all he could think about was Lily. Lily, who was sitting at table 14, watching him, absorbing every pitying glance and condescending smile. She was 8 years old. She didn't understand the nuances of adult cruelty, but she understood enough. She could see that people were looking at her father like he was something to be pied, something less than. He found her at the table, her éclair half-eaten, her expression troubled in a way that made his heart ache. She looked up at him as he approached, and her small voice cut through the noise of the reception like a knife. "Daddy, why do people keep looking at you like that?" Nathan crouched down beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level. Like what, sweetheart? Like they feel sorry for you. Lily's brow furrowed, and she reached out to touch his face with sticky chocolate fingers. Are you sad? He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm, tasting sugar and innocence. I'm fine, baby. Sometimes people just don't know how to act at parties. But Lily wasn't convinced. She was too smart for that. Too perceptive. And Nathan could see the questions forming in her eyes. Questions he didn't know how to answer without breaking something inside both of them. He needed air. He needed space. He needed to be anywhere but here, surrounded by people who saw him as nothing more than a cautionary tale. Stay here for a minute. Okay. Nathan smoothed Lily's hair back from her face and forced a smile. Daddy needs to step outside. I'll be right back. He left her at the table with her juice and her half-finished dessert, weaving through the crowd toward the French doors that led to the hotel's garden. The night air hit him like a wave, cool, clean, carrying the scent of jasmine and freshly cut grass. The garden was beautiful, all manicured hedges and stone pathways, and twinkling lights strung through the trees. But Nathan saw none of it. He walked until he found a bench near the edge of the property, hidden from view by a wall of flowering bushes, and he sat down heavily, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed. This was a mistake. Coming here, asking Victoria, believing that he could somehow salvage his dignity in front of people who had already decided what he was worth. All of it was a mistake. Rachel didn't want him here to be civil. She wanted him here to witness her triumph, to serve as living proof that she had made the right choice in leaving him. And he had walked right into it, dragging his daughter along, subjecting Lily to the same judgment and pity that he had tried so hard to shield her from. Nathan stared at the ground, his vision blurring slightly, and let himself feel the full weight of his failure. He wasn't angry at Rachel, not really. She had made her choice years ago, and he had accepted it. He wasn't even angry at Brandon, whose smugness was just the predictable behavior of a man who had never been tested. He was angry at himself for hoping, for trying, for believing that putting on a new suit and showing up with his head held high would somehow change the way the world saw him. It wouldn't. It never would. He was Nathan Reed, the secretary, the ex-husband, the single father who couldn't give his wife the life she wanted. That was his story, and no amount of pretending would rewrite it. He sat there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, listening to the muffled sounds of the reception drifting through the garden. Music, laughter, the clink of glasses raised in celebration. Inside that ballroom, life was going on without him. People were dancing and drinking and making toasts to the happy couple. And out here in the dark, he was exactly what everyone expected him to be, alone. Nathan made a decision. He would go back inside, find Lily, and take her home. There was no point in staying any longer. No dignity left to salvage. No reason to subject either of them to more of this. He would apologize to his daughter for bringing her to a place where she had to watch her father be diminished. He would tuck her into bed and read her a story and pretend that none of this had happened. And tomorrow he would wake up and go back to work and continue being the person he had always been. Reliable, responsible, invisible. He stood up from the bench, brushing off his jacket, preparing to walk back into that ballroom as the man everyone expected him to be. A failure, a footnote, someone to be pied and forgotten. And then he heard the sound of a car pulling up to the hotel entrance. Nathan turned toward the sound, expecting nothing. Perhaps a late-arriving guest, perhaps a caterer's delivery van. What he saw instead made him freeze where he stood. A black sedan had pulled up to the hotel's main entrance, sleek and expensive, the kind of car that belonged to someone who didn't need to impress anyone. The driver stepped out and opened the rear passenger door, and a woman emerged into the glow of the entrance lights. She was wearing a black evening gown, simple but elegant, the kind of dress that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. Her hair was swept back from her face, and she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had walked into boardrooms full of hostile executives and walked out with everything she wanted. Victoria Ashford stood at the entrance of the Grand View Hotel, scanning the grounds with sharp, deliberate eyes. Nathan watched from his hidden spot in the garden, his heart pounding against his ribs, unable to move or speak or even breathe. Fourth, she was here after everything. After the flat refusal, after the silence that followed, after he had convinced himself that hope was a luxury he couldn't afford, she was here. He didn't understand. He couldn't make sense of it. But before he could gather his thoughts, her gaze found him across the distance, and she began walking in his direction. She moved through this garden with purpose, her heels clicking softly against the stone pathway, and Nathan realized that he was still standing there like a statue, his mouth slightly open, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. Victoria stopped a few feet away from him, her expression unreadable in the dim light, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the reception drifted through the night air. Music, laughter, the distant clink of glasses. But here in the garden, surrounded by jasmine and shadows, there was only silence. You came. Nathan's voice sounded strange to his own ears, rough and uncertain, like a man who had forgotten how to speak. Victoria tilted her head slightly, studying him with those cool, assessing eyes. I said no to pretending to be your girlfriend, she said, her tone as measured as ever. I never said no to showing up. Nathan shook his head slowly, still struggling to process what was happening. I don't understand. Why would you? Because you asked. Victoria cut him off, her voice quiet but firm. In 4 years, you've never asked me for anything. Not a race, not a day off, not even a longer lunch break. And then you walked into my office and asked me to do something that clearly cost you everything just to say out loud. She took a step closer and Nathan could see something in her eyes that he had never seen before. Not warmth exactly, but something close to it. I don't do things like this, but I also don't ignore people who deserve to have someone standing next to them. She extended her hand toward him, palm up, waiting. Let's go inside. Nathan looked at her hand, then at her face, then back at her hand. A part of him wanted to refuse, to tell her that he didn't need saving, that he had already made peace with being the man everyone expected him to be. But that part was small, and to tear it and losing the argument against the larger part, the part that had been humiliated and pied and reduced to a footnote all evening, the part that wanted just once to walk back into that ballroom with his head held high. He took her hand. They walked through the garden together, past the flowering bushes and the twinkling lights, toward the French doors that led back into the reception. Nathan could feel the warmth of Victoria's fingers against his palm, the steady pressure of her grip, and something shifted inside his chest. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. He had spent the entire evening feeling invisible, insignificant, like a ghost haunting his own past. But walking beside Victoria, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Seen. The moment they stepped into the ballroom, the atmosphere changed. It was subtle at first, a few heads turning, a few conversations trailing off mid-sentence, but within seconds, the shift had spread through the entire room like a wave. Nathan felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes landing on him. But this time, they weren't filled with pity or condescension. They were filled with surprise, curiosity, and something that looked almost like respect. The whispers started immediately, but they were different now. Who is that? A woman in pearls murmured to her husband. She looks familiar? A man near the bar squinted at Victoria. Then his eyes widened with recognition. Wait, isn't that Victoria Ashford, the CEO of Ashford Group? The name rippled through the crowd, carrying with it the weight of reputation and power, and Nathan watched as the same people who had dismissed him minutes ago suddenly straightened their postures and adjusted their expressions. Rachel noticed them first. She was standing near the head table, accepting congratulations from a group of older women, when her gaze drifted toward the entrance and landed on Nathan. Her smile faltered. Her face went pale. And when she saw the woman standing beside him, really saw her, recognized her, understood what her presence meant, something flickered in her eyes that Nathan had never seen before. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. Brandon appeared at Rachel's side, following her gaze, and his reaction was equally telling. The easy confidence that had defined him all evening seemed to waver slightly, replaced by something more cautious, more calculating. He approached Nathan and Victoria with his hand extended. But there was none of the smugness that had colored their earlier interaction. I don't believe we've met, Brandon said, his voice carefully neutral. Brandon Hayes. Victoria accepted the handshake with a brief, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Victoria Ashford, I'm here with Nathan. She released his hand and turned to Rachel, who was hovering nearby like a moth drawn to a flame she knew would burn her. Congratulations on your wedding. I hope you'll both be very happy. The words were pleasant enough, but something in Victoria's tone made them sound like a dismissal. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time all evening, she had nothing to say. No clever remarks, no subtle digs, no condescending observations about Nathan's lonely life. She simply stood there looking at the woman beside her ex-husband, and Nathan could see her recalculating everything she thought she knew about him. A small voice broke through the tension. "Daddy." Nathan turned to see Lily running toward him from table 14, her blue dress swirling around her knees, her face lit up with excitement. She skidded to a stop in front of him and Victoria, looking up at the elegant stranger with wide, curious eyes. "Who's this?" Lily asked, tugging at Nathan's sleeve. Nathan crouched down to his daughter's level, bringing Victoria into her line of sight. "This is my boss, sweetheart. Her name is Victoria." Victoria surprised him. Then she lowered herself gracefully, bending at the knees until she was almost eye level with Lily, and her expression softened in a way that Nathan had never witnessed in 4 years of working for her. "Hello, Lily. Your father talks about you all the time." Her voice was gentle, almost warm. "He's very proud of you. Did you know that?" Lily beamed, chocolate still smudged at the corner of her mouth. "Daddy says I'm the prettiest girl in the whole city." "He's right," Victoria said simply. And when she stood up again, she placed her hand lightly on Nathan's arm. A small gesture barely noticeable, but one that said everything that needed to be said. They didn't stay much longer. There was no need. Nathan made polite excuses to the few people who tried to engage him in conversation, collected Lily's jacket from the coat check, and walked out of the Grand View Hotel with his daughter on one side and Victoria on the other. The black sedan was still waiting at the entrance, and Victoria's driver held the door open as they climbed inside. First Lily, then Nathan, then Victoria herself. The car pulled away from the hotel, leaving behind the crystal chandeliers and the marble floors and the whispers that had followed Nathan all evening. Lily fell asleep within minutes, her head resting against Nathan's shoulder, her breathing soft and even. Nathan watched the city lights slide past the window, trying to find the words for what he was feeling and failing. "Thank you," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to. You don't need to thank me." Victoria was looking out her own window, her profile sharp against the passing lights. "You deserve to have someone there. That's all." Nathan waited for her to say something more about what this meant, about whether things would be different between them now, about any of the questions swirling in his mind. But she didn't. She simply sat there in comfortable silence, asking nothing, expecting nothing, offering nothing except her presence. And somehow that was exactly what Nathan needed. The car stopped in front of his apartment building, a modest brick structure that looked almost shabby compared to the luxury they had just left behind. Nathan gathered Lily in his arms, careful not to wake her, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. Victoria didn't follow. She remained in the car, watching him through the open door. "Good night, Nathan," she said quietly. "Good night, Victoria." He carried his sleeping daughter up 3 flights of stairs, unlocked the door to their small apartment, and laid her gently on her bed. She stirred slightly as he pulled the blanket over her shoulders, murmuring something unintelligible, then settled back into sleep with a contented sigh. Nathan stood there for a long moment, watching her breathe, feeling the quiet weight of the evening finally begin to lift from his shoulders. He walked to the window and looked out at the city below. The distant lights, the empty streets, the ordinary world that had nothing to do with crystal chandeliers or designer gowns or the judgment of strangers. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a failure. He didn't feel like a footnote in someone else's story. He felt like exactly what he was, a good father, a decent man, someone who had been tested and had come through it with his dignity intact. Victoria hadn't promised him anything. She hadn't offered love or a future or any of the things that people usually expected from moments like this. She had simply shown up. She had stood beside him. And in doing so, she had reminded him of something he had almost forgotten, that his worth wasn't determined by the people who looked down on him, but by the person he chose to be. Nathan turned away from the window and walked to Lily's room one last time, watching her sleep in the soft glow of her nightlight. Tomorrow, life would go on. He would wake up early, make breakfast, take her to school, and then head to the office where Victoria would greet him with the same cool professionalism she always had. Nothing would change, and everything would be different. He was free now. Free from the past, free from the judgment, free from the need to prove himself to anyone. and that he realized was enough.